The hot summer enveloped the small southern town in a soft wave, soaked with the smell of blossoming trees and spicy herbs. Here, in the suburban silence, where everyone knew everyone, life flowed in a measured and unhurried way. In these quiet streets lived two elderly men whose lives, despite appearances of stability, were full of hidden resentments, unfinished stories, and deep contradictions. Robert Harris was a man who was always looked upon with respect. His strong, trim figure, despite his age, gave him away as a former military man. Robert had once been a symbol of discipline, strength, and courage. He had commanded a company, and his medals, collected during his years of service, hung in a special order on his living room wall, a reminder of a time when his decisions determined destinies. Now, his life was a series of monotonous days. Retired, Robert had settled in this quiet neighborhood where every bush and every tree witnessed his attempts to find peace in a quiet life. But something inside him wouldn't fully accept that his best years were behind him. His neighbor, Lawrence Jackson, was the complete opposite. Lawrence was a former teacher, and despite his 70 years, retained the same gentleness and kindness in his eyes that had always attracted people to him. His gray hair was neatly slicked back, his glasses dangled on a thin silver chain, and he could often be seen holding a book. Lawrence was known for his smile and friendliness, but beneath that facade lurked a man who knew how to manipulate others into getting what he wanted. He knew how to influence people by playing on their weaknesses, and this trait made him a quiet but dangerous opponent. Robert and Lawrence lived side by side for many years, but their relationship always remained on the line between politeness and latent dislike. The respect they showed each other was more of an obligation than sincerity. They tried not to cross paths too often, though each knew more about the other's life than they would admit. Their quiet existence changed when Ciara Lewis, a 16-year-old girl living a few houses down from Robert and Lawrence, appeared on the streets of the town. Ciara was what everyone called a sweet girl. She was kind, helpful, and always ready to help. She often helped neighbors with household chores, bringing groceries, helping in the garden, or just dropping by for a chat. Her appearance on the streets was like a breath of fresh air for the residents, especially for the two elderly men whose lives up to that point had seemed like an endless gray area. Robert was the first to take notice of Ciara. He saw in her not only the youth and energy he sorely lacked, but also a memory of the days when life was still full of possibilities. She brought him the newspaper in the mornings and sometimes stayed for a few minutes to talk. Robert, accustomed to discipline and control, tried to be strict with her, but each time her smile made him feel softer. He started inviting her over for tea, and one day he gave her an old medal that had meant a lot to him in the past. The medal wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of his affection, a hidden desire to give her more than just senile guidance. Lawrence did not stay away either. He was a man who always found a way to remain the center of attention. When Ciara began to stop by Robert's house, Lawrence was quick to take notice. He offered to help her with her studies, knowing that she dreamed of going to college. It was an opportunity for Lawrence to show he cared, but his motives were much deeper than that. He began giving her books, telling her stories about his past and the future opportunities that would open up for her if she continued her education. Each of the men were attaching themselves to Ciara in their own way, trying to win her attention. But there was a fine line in their actions that they didn't realize. Their interest in the girl went beyond simple friendship. They were both looking for something in her that they no longer had: youth, energy, and a chance to feel needed. At first, their rivalry was barely noticeable. Ciara didn't realize what was going on around her. She thought both men were just being kind and caring, and she gratefully accepted their help. But soon the tension between Robert and Lawrence began to grow. Each felt that the other was trying to take more of a place in Ciara's life than was allowed. One day, when Ciara came to Robert's house to help him with the garden, Lawrence was in the neighboring yard. He watched them from a distance, pretending to be minding his own business. His eyes scrutinized Ciara's every move, and when Robert motioned for her to come inside, Lawrence clenched his fists. He felt something was changing, that his control over the situation was beginning to slip away. Robert, for his part, was also beginning to notice that Lawrence was spending too much time with Ciara. Their conversations seemed to get deeper, and his smile became too wide when she appeared. This irritated Robert, who was used to being the one person who was trusted. One evening, as the sun was slipping toward sunset, Ciara sat on Lawrence's porch, chatting with him about books. Robert, coming home, saw the two of them. He stopped for a moment, watching them. A feeling flared up inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time: jealousy. He knew he couldn't just walk up and demand her attention, but something in him said Lawrence was taking it too far. The quiet rivalry that had been imperceptible to Ciara was becoming more and more apparent to both old men. Each was trying to assert his right to her attention, and each felt that attention slipping away. Ciara, unsuspecting, went on with her life, enjoying each new day. Her kindness and sincerity made both men feel younger than they really were. But what they didn't see was the vulnerability and danger behind that youth. Both men were beginning to feel that this wasn't just a friendship. It was a way for them to prove to themselves that their lives still had meaning. One day, Ciara brought Lawrence a notebook with an essay in which she described her dreams for the future. Lawrence read her lines and wondered. She's still so young, he thought, and I have so little time. Robert, for his part, looked at the locket she wore and felt proud that the symbol belonged to him. Neither Ciara nor the other townsfolk had any idea that this rivalry between the two older men would begin to slowly escalate into something dangerous. The heat that was so firmly entrenched in the town this summer only seemed to intensify, reflecting the growing tension between Robert and Lawrence with each passing day. Their polite smiles and exchanges of pleasantries became more strained. Looking at each other, both men knew that their friendship was teetering on the edge, and only a thin mask of propriety concealed their true feelings. Ciara continued to be that sunshine girl whose presence filled the lives of each of the men she appeared at Robert's house and at Lawrence's, bringing light and warmth with her youthful enthusiasm. For her, it was just helping neighbors, nothing more. But for the two old men, it became a real struggle for attention and recognition. Robert watched her every move, feeling that something meaningful was reappearing in his life. The medallion he had recently given Ciara was a symbol of his inner victory. This ancient artifact, passed down in his family from generation to generation, was one of the most precious objects he kept. Ciara, seeing this gesture as a gesture of care and respect, gratefully accepted the medallion, often wore it around her neck, and even showed it to Lawrence when she visited him. "It is simply incredible, Mr. Jackson." Robert said that this locket belonged to his grandfather. "It looks so antique and beautiful," Ciara said as she showed Lawrence the gift, glowing with delight. Lawrence, looking at the locket, felt something stirring inside his soul. The unpleasant feeling from which he had been trying to rid himself for the past weeks had once more taken possession of his thoughts. It was jealousy mixed with dislike of Robert, whom he had always thought excessively proud and arrogant. At this moment, Lawrence realized that he could no longer remain aloof. He began to take Robert's every attempt to deepen his relationship with Ciara as a personal threat. "Yes, it's certainly a meaningful gift," Lawrence said, trying to hide his irritation behind a knowing smile. "But remember, Ciara, you have a great future ahead of you. Things are just symbols, but the real future lies in your education." Lawrence's words did not sound strange to Ciara. She had always seen him as a teacher, a mentor, someone who helped her understand the world better. He gave her books, talked to her about life and universities, and she saw him as a kind of wise grandfather. But Ciara didn't realize that his interest in her was much deeper than mere concern. Lawrence was beginning to feel like not just a mentor, but the guardian of her soul, and that left no room for rivals. The next day, when Ciara came to Lawrence with another request to help her with her studies, he was more determined than ever. Lawrence knew he couldn't let Robert steal her away. It wasn't just a matter of rivalry, it was a matter of principle. He had to prove that it was his attention that mattered to her. He offered Ciara some serious help that he had only mentioned in passing before. "Ciara, you know that I see great potential in you. Your dream of college can become a reality. I'm willing to help you financially if necessary," Lawrence said, looking at the girl intently. "I could pay for your tuition if you decide to enroll." Ciara was stunned. Her dream did involve studying, but her family couldn't afford such an expense. She hadn't expected such generosity from Lawrence, and this offer came as a surprise to her. "I don't even know what to say, Mr. Jackson. It's too generous," she said, feeling joy and embarrassment struggling inside her. "There's no need to worry, Ciara." Lawrence smiled softly. "You deserve better. You're smart and hardworking, and I believe you can achieve anything you dream of. Let me help you." Ciara nodded gratefully, but her heart was full of doubts. Lawrence's offer was tempting, but she couldn't escape the thought that it was somehow too unusual. Still, she didn't want to seem ungrateful, and decided to mull over the offer. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Meanwhile, Robert began to notice that Ciara was spending more time at Lawrence's. This caused him resentment that he could not hide. Suspicions were growing in his mind that Lawrence was somehow trying to manipulate the girl to get her away from him. When Ciara had told him of Lawrence's offer to pay for her studies, Robert had flared up. "That old fox! He's just trying to buy your attention, Ciara," Robert blurted out as they sat having a cup of tea on his veranda. "Don't let him use you like that." Ciara was surprised at that tone. Robert had always been reserved and calm, but his reaction to Lawrence's suggestion struck her as odd. She didn't understand what was going on between the two men, but her intuition told her it wasn't just a rivalry. "He's not trying to use me, Robert. He just wants to help," she objected cautiously. "That doesn't mean I'll necessarily accept his offer." Robert clenched his fists, trying not to betray his real feelings. He felt that he was being lost, that Lawrence was taking over what should have been his, but he couldn't express it directly. After all, Ciara was a free person, and he had no right to dictate anything to her. However, irritation was growing inside him, growing into real rage. "I just want you to be careful, Ciara," Robert said, in a softer tone. "Not everything is as it seems at first glance." Ciara looked at him, but said nothing. She sensed that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They could no longer pretend that nothing was going on. Their conversations became cold and their gazes prickly. Every move Ciara made was now seen as a signal for action. Robert increasingly tried to show his superiority, alluding to his military achievements and his leadership. Lawrence, for his part, continued to persist in convincing Ciara that a future with education was more important than anything else. One evening when Ciara came to Robert's house again, he gave her an old book that he thought she would fall in love with. It was his way of showing that he appreciated her intellectual pursuits, not just her youth and beauty. Ciara accepted the book gratefully, but when she mentioned in passing in conversation that she had just finished reading one of the books Lawrence had given her, Robert flinched. "Lawrence? He gives you books?" he asked with obvious displeasure. "Yes, he helps me with my exams. He knows a lot about literature and history," Ciara answered carelessly. This answer hurt Robert deeply. Lawrence, as it seemed to him, was winning the battle for Ciara's attention. He saw his rival penetrating deeper and deeper into her world, and it was unbearable. Meanwhile, Lawrence couldn't stay away either. He was becoming more and more convinced that Robert was a threat to his influence over Ciara. One day when Ciara came to see him, he noticed that she was wearing the very same locket, and that was the final straw for him. "Ciara, you seem to have a strong attachment to that locket," Lawrence said with an artificial smile. "Yes, I like it very much. It's a family heirloom of Robert's, and I feel it's something meaningful," she replied, adjusting the chain around her neck. Lawrence felt his patience wearing thin. The sun was slowly sinking, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Ciara had just left Lawrence's house with the new book he had given her to study for her exams. She walked down the familiar street, immersed in thoughts of how she would resolve the difficult choice between Lawrence's proposal and Robert's attentions. To her, it all seemed a show of concern on the part of the two old men, but she could not have guessed how dangerous their furtive struggle for her attention had become. Meanwhile, Robert, sitting on his veranda, watched Ciara leave Lawrence's house. His heart was once more seized with anger and anxiety. He couldn't bear the thought of Lawrence using his book tricks to pull the girl into his world. Robert was too proud of his family tradition and experience to allow Lawrence to take from him what he considered his own. He rose from his seat and went into the house, slamming the door firmly behind him. He couldn't sit idly by any longer, realizing that Lawrence was gaining more and more of Ciara's trust. He needed to talk to him, to put things right. This had to end once and for all. Lawrence, unaware of the anger that blazed in Robert's chest, stood at the window and watched Ciara move away. He was pleased that he was able to offer her help again, and that her affection for him was growing stronger. The locket Ciara wore annoyed him more each time he saw it, as a symbol that she still remained under Robert's influence. Just as he was about to close the window and return to his business, there was a sharp knock on the door. Lawrence frowned. The knock was insistent and even threatening. "Who is there?" he asked loudly, approaching the door. "It's me, Robert. Open up. We need to talk," came the reply from the other side. Lawrence felt something inside him freeze. He knew perfectly well that this visit did not bode well. The tension between them had reached a breaking point in recent weeks, and this conversation could be decisive. He opened the door and saw Robert standing before him with his arms crossed over his chest and a determined expression on his face. "Is something the matter, Robert?" Lawrence asked, trying to remain calm. "You know exactly what's wrong," Robert growled, stepping forward. "I'm tired of your manipulations with Ciara. You think you can just barge into her life and decide for her what's best for her? Enough. This has to end." Lawrence took a step back without closing the door and looked at Robert carefully. "Manipulation? Are you talking about manipulation?" he interjected coldly. "You started it first, giving her the medallion, that symbol of your superiority. You think you can buy her attention? But she's not a thing, Robert." Robert stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't know what you're talking about. I didn't give her the locket for me, but because I care for her as my daughter. I'm not trying to use her like you are. You just want to control her." "Are you a saint, then?" Lawrence grinned. "There's no need to make a hero of yourself, Robert. We both know you want her around because you feel alone and helpless. You're afraid you'll never be able to be important to anyone again." Those words hit Robert in the heart. He frowned and froze for a moment, realizing that Lawrence had hit the very spot. But instead of pulling away, he felt his anger grow, filling every fiber of his being. "You have no right to talk to me like that," Robert said deafeningly. "Ciara will be better off without you." Lawrence grinned and folded his arms across his chest. "Is that what you think? Or maybe she's already made her choice, Robert. Maybe it's time for you to admit that she prefers my company." These words were the last straw. Robert, seething with rage, lashed out at Lawrence, clenching his fists. Their clash was instantaneous and furious. The two older men, each clinging to his own idea of justice and righteousness, clashed in a furious struggle. Lawrence was stronger than he might have appeared at first glance. Despite his age and friendly appearance, he knew how to stand up for himself. Robert, on the other hand, was blinded by anger and lost control of his actions. The fight lasted only a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity to both of them. In the end, they pushed each other away, breathing heavily. "This is only the beginning," Lawrence hissed, wiping the blood from his lip. "What are you talking about?" Robert could hardly contain himself, realizing that if they continued to fight, the consequences could be far more serious. Both men knew this was more than just a fight over Ciara. It was a personal, deep-seated sense of injustice and jealousy. But that was only the prologue to what was to come. Night covered the town in thick darkness. Silence spilled over the streets and everything seemed peaceful. Ciara sat in her room, paging through the pages of the book Lawrence had given her. She was immersed in her thoughts, trying to figure out her best course of action. Her dreams of college and independence were at the forefront of her mind, but it was all beginning to seem too complicated. While the attention from the older men was nice, it also made her uneasy. Both men seemed to see her as more than just a girl to help, but something more. The ringing of the doorbell broke her musings. Ciara glanced at her watch. It was late. Who could have come at this hour? She got out of bed and walked slowly to the door, not realizing that something would happen beyond this evening that would turn her life upside down. When she opened the door, there was a man standing on the threshold, his face obscured by shadows. His voice was barely audible, but there was a cold determination in it. "We need to talk, Kiara," he said quietly. Kiara froze, feeling her heart sink with anxiety. She hadn't expected to see this man at this hour, and something inside her told her that this wasn't just a visit. What happened next was shrouded in obscurity. The night covered up all traces, but when morning came, the horrible truth came out into the light. Ciara's body was found the next morning at Lawrence's house. Her dead body lay in the living room, her face disfigured in a struggle she had clearly tried to fight to the last. The locals were shocked to learn what had happened. A young girl everyone knew and loved had been brutally murdered in the home of one of the most respected people in town. The police immediately launched an investigation. Detective Martin Jenkins, who arrived on the scene, examined the crime scene with a wary expression on his face. Forensic scientists worked all over the room collecting evidence. Lawrence's house was spotless, except for the signs of a struggle that told their own story. "Who was the last person to see her alive?" Jenkins asked, looking around the room. "Not known yet, sir," replied one of the officers. "We found her at Lawrence's house, but he himself denies having seen her after 10 o'clock at night. Neighbors say she visited him often, but no one knows what happened last night." Jenkins frowned. Everything pointed to the murder being the result of a sudden fit of rage, but who was responsible? Lawrence had denied involvement, but there was still one name that had come up in conversations: Robert Harris. "We must question everyone who might have been with her in the last hours," Jenkins said, looking down the street. "We'll start with Lawrence and Robert." Thus began an investigation that would uncover the dark secrets of this small community and reveal which of the two old men had dared to commit such a cruel act. The morning brought to the city not only an oppressive atmosphere of grief, but also waves of anxiety. Ciara's death stirred everyone, even those who did not know her personally. The police cars blocking the entrance to Lawrence's house drew the attention of the locals, causing them to whisper and exchange anxious glances. For many, especially those who knew Ciara, the murder was something unimaginable, too horrific for their quiet community. Detective Jamal Pearson arrived on the scene mid-morning. A tall man with sharp facial features and attentive eyes, he was well known for his ability to solve the most intricate cases. His methodical nature and attention to detail made him the perfect candidate for this investigation, but even he couldn't hide his astonishment when he saw the horrible state in which the body of the young girl had been found. Jamal slowly made his way through the cordon that the police had set up and headed towards Lawrence's house. Forensics were already at work on the scene, gathering evidence, photographing the room, and every detail that could be relevant to the case. Pearson quietly greeted his colleagues and turned his attention to Detective Martin Jenkins, who was first on the scene. "Jamal?" Martin nodded as he approached him. "I'm glad you're here. This case is a nightmare. A girl was killed in Lawrence's house, but he swears he wasn't involved. We're beginning to unravel the tangle, but there are too many contradictions." "Tell me what you know," Jamal asked, looking around. Jenkins gestured for him to come inside. The room where Ciara had been found looked remarkably clean, but the signs of a struggle were obvious. An overturned chair, shards of glass, and drops of blood on the floor suggested that something terrible had happened here in her last moments. "The body was found here," Jenkins said, pointing to a spot next to the couch. "Ciara had been severely beaten. There are multiple bruises on her body, indicating a struggle. Forensics think she was hit with something heavy, possibly a vase or a lamp. But the weird thing is, we found a locket in her hand. She was clutching it when she was found." Jamal frowned. "A locket? There's something special about it?" "Yeah, it's a family heirloom," Jenkins replied. "Robert Harris, Lawrence's neighbor, gave it to her a few weeks ago. We've already questioned him, but he claims he hasn't seen Ciara since the day he gave it to her. However, the fact that she was holding it in her hand when she died is disturbing." Pearson picked up the locket wrapped in a plastic bag that the forensic scientist handed him. It was a beautiful but old piece, oval in shape, with delicate engravings on the surface. There were no pictures inside the locket, only a tiny mirror, which made it even more mysterious. "This locket could be important evidence," Jamal murmured, examining it from different angles. "What else do we know?" "We've started questioning the neighbors," Jenkins continued. They claim that Ciara was a frequent visitor to Lawrence's house, but no one saw her come in here the night of the murder. As for Lawrence, he claims he went to bed early that night and only woke up in the morning when he heard the sound of police cars. But his testimony seems too even, as if he had prepared for it in advance. Jamal nodded, realizing that Lawrence was one of the key suspects, though not the only one. "What about Robert?" he asked, glancing at the locket. He was close to Ciara too, after all. "Robert is another complicated figure," Jenkins replied. "He and Lawrence seem to be competing for Ciara's attention. Some neighbors say there was growing tension between them, even arguments. But Robert swears he knows nothing about her murder. He claims he was home all night." "And we have his alibi?" Jamal clarified. "Not yet," Jenkins shook his head. "But we don't have direct evidence against him either. We need to keep looking into their relationship. It might help us figure out which one of them might have decided to kill." Jamal, focusing on the details, took a deep breath. "We'll have to start with interviews. I want to talk to both suspects in person. We need to figure out which one of them is lying." Robert Harris was the first to be interviewed. He was sitting across from Jamal in a small room at the police station. Robert looked calm, but his eyes showed fatigue and underlying tension. Jamal started with simple questions, wanting to find out how much Robert was attached to Ciara. "Tell me about your relationship to Ciara," Jamal said calmly, making notes in his notebook. Robert sighed, lowering his head. "Ciara, she was like a daughter to me. I knew her since she was a child, always trying to help her when she needed it. That locket?" Robert stopped talking, his voice shaking. "It was a symbol of our friendship. It belonged to my mother, and I decided to give it to Ciara because I saw her as someone who deserved it." "When was the last time you saw her?" Jamal asked. "A few days ago," Robert answered. "I saw her leaving Lawrence, but I didn't go near her. It seemed to me that she was getting close enough to him that I didn't want to interfere." "Did you know that tension was building between you and Lawrence?" Jamal asked, looking straight into Robert's eyes. He frowned slightly. "Yes, of course. I saw him trying to gain her trust. But I didn't want to make a scene, you know? I thought it was up to Ciara to decide who was closest to her." "You couldn't help but feel jealous, though, could you?" Jamal pressed on, his voice a little harder. Robert pressed his lips together and was silent for a moment. "Yes, I felt it. I was angry with him. But that doesn't mean I killed her. Where were you the night she died?" Jamal asked coldly. Robert looked away, avoiding the detective's gaze. "I was at home, alone. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But I didn't go anywhere." Jamal continued to ask questions, but Robert stood his ground. His alibi was weak, but not completely irrefutable. After the interrogation was over, Jamal wasn't sure he was lying, but his story didn't seem completely honest either. Lawrence looked much more collected when he came in for questioning. He sat with a straight back and looked at Jamal without fear or worry, as if he were certain of his innocence. "You claim you didn't see Ciara the night she died," Jamal began, opening his case. "So why was her body in your house?" Lawrence frowned. "I don't know myself, Detective. I was shocked when I found out about it. I really didn't see or hear anything. I have no explanation for how she ended up in my house." "But she visited you often, didn't she?" Jamal asked. "Yes, she came to me for advice. I helped her with her studies, talked to her about college. She was a very smart girl. She had a great future. But I never thought our meetings would end up like this." "And you never felt there was any conflict between you and Robert over her?" Jamal watched Lawrence's reaction carefully. Lawrence looked at him sharply. Of course he and I were at odds. The days following Ciara's tragic death stretched slowly and agonizingly for everyone involved. In any way, the death of the young girl had shaken the town, and the suspicions surrounding the two old men, Robert and Lawrence, were becoming more and more grounded and tense. Detective Jamal Pearson took his time, carefully examining every piece of evidence, listening to testimony, and building a fragile chain of events that led to Ciara's death. At first glance, the case seemed confusing and contradictory. Both suspects had a motive. Their affection for the girl was undeniable, and each of them was trying to win her favor. Both denied involvement in the murder, but each was hiding something important. Jamal knew he had to find that small, almost imperceptible detail that would reveal the whole truth. The dawn of the next day brought clarity to the case. Jamal sat in his office, surrounded by folders of investigative material. He was once again going through the evidence collected at the crime scene, thinking through all the leads. The locket that Ciara had held in her hand at the time of her death continued to occupy his thoughts. The locket was a symbol of deep affection. It was the one Robert had given Ciara. But the strange thing was exactly how the girl was clutching it. Ciara wasn't just holding the locket in her hand. It was as if she was trying to protect it or hide it from someone. It made Jamal wonder, why was the abused girl reaching for the locket? What exactly did it mean to her at that moment? Another detail kept him on his toes: Lawrence's testimony. He claimed to have been asleep the night of the murder and heard nothing suspicious. However, forensics showed that the door to Lawrence's house had been broken, indicating that someone had entered by force or in a moment of panic. Lawrence could not have failed to notice the noise if he was indeed in the house. The detective made a few calls, checking the latest details with forensics. A picture was beginning to emerge, and Jamal felt he was on the verge of a clue. The interrogations continued, and this time Jamal set out to see if the events of that night had anything to do with the mental state of the two old men. He decided to start with Robert, who, despite his outwardly calm nature, seemed increasingly withdrawn and nervous. "Robert, I know you had strong feelings for Ciara," Jamal began, watching the suspect's reaction. "You gave her a locket that means a lot to you. That gift was important to you, wasn't it?" "Yes," Robert answered, lowering his head. "It was my mother. She used to say that someone who deserved love should have the locket. I thought Ciara deserved it." "Why did you decide to give it to her at that very moment?" Jamal squinted, noting the nervous trembling of Robert's hands. "I wanted to show her what she meant to me," the old man murmured. "I knew Lawrence was attached to her too, and I didn't want to scare him away. But things got too complicated." "What do you mean?" The detective leaned forward, sensing that he was approaching a key part of the conversation. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to collect his thoughts. "I was afraid I'd lose her. Afraid she'd leave us, that she'd choose Lawrence or someone else. And I can't be the same. I'm old, and I don't have anything to offer her anymore. I just wanted her around." Jamal frowned. "Did you know she was planning to leave? She was going to college, right?" Robert nodded, his voice becoming barely audible. "She told me about it. Said she wanted to go to another city. It was painful to hear. I knew I'd lose her if she left, but I didn't want that. I wanted her to stay." "And you were determined to stop her at all costs?" Jamal asked with pressure. Robert raised his head sharply, his eyes widening in horror. "No, I didn't kill her!" he screamed. "I loved her! I wanted her to be happy!" But the detective could see that Robert wasn't telling the whole truth. His hands were trembling, his face was pale, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. Too many contradictions, too much fear. Jamal decided not to press him now, but he already knew Robert was hiding something important. Lawrence was next. He was acting more reserved and seemed confident in his innocence. But Jamal knew that this confidence might have been a mask. "Lawrence," the detective began, "you said you didn't see Ciara the night she died, but there are signs of a break-in at your house. How can you explain that?" Lawrence looked at him with slight irritation. "I've already said I was asleep. I didn't hear anything. But why did Ciara end up in your house? Why did she die in your house?" Lawrence pressed his lips together and after a moment's hesitation replied, "I don't know. Maybe she came to me for help. Maybe someone else brought her here." "Did you feel any jealousy of Robert?" Jamal asked, looking intently at Lawrence. He hesitated a moment. "Yes," he admitted at last. "Of course I did. He was important to her. But I didn't kill her. I respected her too much to hurt her." Jamal hesitated for a moment. Lawrence seemed more composed and in control of his emotions, but there was still something wrong. However, the detective decided not to jump to conclusions. The final pieces of the puzzle came together late in the afternoon when Jamal received the results of the locket's analysis. There were traces of blood on the surface, indicating that Ciara had clutched it in the last moments of her life. But most importantly, there was another detail on the inside of the chain: skin particles. The medallion's role turned out to be far more important than the detective had originally thought. The blood belonged to Ciara, but the skin particles on the chain indicated that the locket could have been used as a weapon in the struggle. Now the picture was clear. Jamal called Robert back in for questioning. "Robert," he began, "the locket was in Ciara's hand when she was found, but there's something you didn't mention. You used that locket when she tried to get away from you, didn't you?" Robert turned pale. His eyes darted to the side, as if he were looking for an escape. "It was an accident," he whispered. "I didn't mean to kill her. She said she was leaving for good, that she didn't need me or Lawrence anymore. I lost control." Robert covered his face with his hands, his body trembling. "I tried to stop her. She fought back and I choked her with the locket. I didn't know it would end like this." Jamal watched him carefully. It was clear now. Robert was consumed with jealousy and fear of losing Ciara forever. His old age, his powerlessness over the girl's youth and dreams had led to the tragedy. The murder was not pre-planned, but was the culmination of a long-simmering conflict in his soul. When Jamal announced Robert's arrest, the town was shocked. No one expected the quiet old man to turn out to be a murderer. However, Robert's motives were so human that anyone who knew him could understand why it happened. The fear of loneliness, the inability to come to terms with the passing of youth and love, led to a tragedy that destroyed the lives of everyone involved. Lawrence remained deeply saddened. His love for Ciara was genuine, but now he knew there was nothing he could have done to prevent her death. The town fell silent, but the trail of tragedy remained. Detective Jamal Pearson closed the case, knowing that the truth is sometimes more bitter than any lie.